Is Jesus the Messiah or not? This is one question that we're going to be asking together as a class, and I'm going to ask you to come up with your own evidence-based answer to this question. But we're still trying to figure out just what a Messiah is. So we need to know what a Messiah is if we're going to decide if Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah or is not. Now we know that King David is the highest example of a Messiah in the nation of Israel. We will see that he is unique among all the kings that rule over God's people, and being associated with him as the son of David is major evidence that Jesus is the Messiah. But David is not the first king that God chooses. So in the first book of Samuel, God chooses a man named Saul to be king. But how that happens is actually really interesting. It's not God who wants a king for his people. God has already chosen Samuel to rule and to guide them. Samuel is the last in a line of non-royal rulers called judges, who serve God's people as a visible leader to help them walk in God's ways and to protect them from their enemies. The judges sort of go all the way back to Moses and Joshua, who lead them into the promised land. But once they're there, Israel starts to forget God's commands and they start worshiping other gods. Think about that for a moment. The people of Israel tell the story every year of God freeing them from horrible slavery in Egypt, and they do this through the celebration of the Passover feast. But as generations pass on to generations, somehow they forget that their God did mighty deeds for them. Their God saved them from oppression and unhappiness when they could never do that themselves. And they forget that Pharaoh was so resistant to God Pharaoh was so addicted to the gods of Egypt that Pharaoh becomes more and more violent until he destroys his country, his child, and his army. And somehow, these descendants of slaves, Pharaoh's slaves, start to look at other gods who did not rescue them and begin worshiping them. From God's perspective, a question that I like to ask is, why did he bother to rescue the Israelites if they were just going to worship other gods just like the Egyptians did? Why would he show his love for them if they were going to refuse it by turning away from the covenant? So just as with the Egyptians, God allows Israel the freedom to choose even when they choose really poorly. So as Israel breaks the covenant with him, they no longer accept his protection, and Israel's enemies begin to attack them and win. And so if they don't choose the God who chose them, they end up being on the receiving end of violence and oppression all over again. Those other gods, the gods of their neighbors, don't really care about Israel. And those other gods don't respond when Israel cries out. But the God of the Israelites does care, and he does respond when finally the Israelites cry out to him. And how he responds is by calling and raising up a leader from humble origin to guide people back to God and to show God's power by conquering his enemies. And this actually happens in a cycle over and over again. God establishes his people peacefully in the promised land, but his people forget the covenant and they worship other gods. So then Israel's enemies rise up and conquer Israel and disturb their peace, and they oppress them. So Israel cries out to God, who is always there to care for them and to save them, and God responds by hearing their cry and raising up a leader to save them. He raises up Samson, who has superhuman strength, and Gideon. He raises up, even though Gideon is a bit of not a really brave man, he gives Gideon only 300 men, and Gideon conquers a huge army. Now there's a judge called Deborah, and she judges and directs the military leader whose name is Barak, and God helps a woman kill the enemy general. In each of these judges, God restores his people to peace and protection until they fall into worshiping other gods again. And so this cycle goes on, and maybe it's this cycle that has the people go to Samuel and say, give us a king. Maybe they want a ruler who will keep them in line. But God says, no, they are rejecting me. Listen to what they say. Look, they're saying to Samuel, you are getting old and your sons don't follow your example. So then appoint a king to rule over us so that we will have a king as other countries do. Rather than every Israelite obeying God in their hearts, they want to obey a king who will rule them with laws and with his army. Israel wants to be strong like other countries with a visible king who will always be there to protect them. But in doing so, they actually give up a good part of their freedom. So God says to Samuel, if they want a king, I will work with them on that. But they need to know what it is that they're choosing. So he says to Samuel, let them know. And so Samuel goes to the people and lays out exactly what it means to have a king. Samuel explains, this is how your king will treat you. He will make soldiers of your sons. He will make some of them officers and others just foot soldiers. Your sons will have to plow his fields and make his weapons. Your daughters will have to make perfumes and bake and cook for him. This king will take your best fields, and he will take a tenth of your grain and your grapes, and he will take your servants and your cattle and your donkeys and your flocks, and you yourselves, Israel, will become his slaves. And Samuel says, when that time comes, you're going to complain bitterly because of your king, whom you yourselves chose, but the Lord will not listen to your complaints. So it seems to me that asking for a king is a lot like asking to go back to Egypt to live under Pharaoh. Hey, but that's none of my business. God has already raised up rulers to protect Israel every time they call out to him. But they want something more. They want a king who will always protect them, even if he ends up oppressing them like Pharaoh did. So here's an interesting question. How is God going to respond to their request? He doesn't want them to be enslaved, and so but he also wants to honor their free choice to live under a king. How is he going to solve this puzzle? For your assignment, I'm going to ask you to please choose one of the judges and read a brief story about how they protected Israel. And then I want you to synthesize how God protected Israel through them, so kind of retell the story. I'm also going to ask you to look for what one of their weaknesses was.